I'm really pleased to welcome to the podcast Christina Dent, who I just met like 8 seconds ago. And I'm really excited for this conversation. Christina is a conservative Christian advocating for a humanized, health-centered approach to the war on drugs. She's the founder and president of End It for Good, which is a nonprofit with a mission to invite people to support approaches to drugs that prioritize life, preserve families, and promote public safety. Her brand new book, and let me see if I can pop it up here, actually. There we go. All right. Her brand new book, Curious, encourages people to see the value of every human life, understand the suffering caused by drug prohibition, and envision how more people can flourish when drug policies prioritize life and health. So please join me, everybody, in welcoming to the podcast for the first time, Christina Dent. Christina, welcome. So let's stir up some controversy, all right?
That's right. Thanks so much for having me, Duke. It's really fun to be here.
Yeah, so good to have you with me. Thank you so much for joining me, for doing this episode. Thank you for sending me your book. It's been awesome to go through it, to listen to your TED Talk that you did a while back, and to read your book and really find out about the work that you're doing. Really, your book is brand new. It was just released, I think, a few weeks ago at the time of this recording. So what's been the reception like so far since your book has come out?
It's been really just overwhelmingly positive. And now maybe people don't tell you if they don't like your book, but there's times where you feel like you can see, this is somebody who went out of their way to say, wow, this has really been helpful. This has really meant a lot to me. I was talking with a guy who's in recovery, and he said, reading the book has been really healing, which is interesting because I'm not a person in recovery. I'm not writing from that voice, but as he went on to describe that, he said, part of it is just how much shame I have carried and how much the response of Christians has played into that. And so reading a fellow Christian talking about this very hard and painful issue in a compassionate and thoughtful way was for him just an acknowledgement of the pain that he has carried. And that is something that was not, I had no concept of that prior to this journey of being a foster parent. I didn't understand addiction at all. All I had to go on was kind of what the culture had told me, which is bad people doing bad things. And that's the end of the story. And not only is that the wrong story, it's not even the beginning of the right story.
Yeah, that's so good. Yeah, it's interesting. I think you and I are very much kind of in the same boat as far as our upbringings and that sort of thing. I've heard you talk about this being a conservative Christian, and I've thought about this as well. I grew up in a Christian home. I've never done a drug in my life. And this is a conversation that I've becoming increasingly interested in, and I've been trying to be more and more just open-minded about. And I think that, and one of the things that you touch on in your writing, as well as in the in from what I've heard from you with your TED Talk and some things like that, it's hard to change our own way of thinking. It's really hard to get other people to change their way of thinking. And there's a lot of this conversation that we're going to get into where we're talking about things. You're talking about things. You're advocating for things that have been so like engraved into the minds of people, of many people, not everybody, but many people for a very, very long time. And when it comes to things like that, it's hard often to hear clearly another perspective that somebody else is bringing into the mix. I wonder, what was it like for you? And I would like to get into just how you got into all this and all of that. But I'm just out of curiosity, I have a question. What was it like for you when you started to go down this road, several years back, and you started to really get into this conversation about rethinking the war on drugs and all of this kind of stuff, being I imagine the kind of people you're connected to, people in your family, people in your church, and that sort of thing. How was this perceived? I wonder if there was pressure on you from people, or if there was if it was a difficult transition for you to make, just in terms of like public perception, and if you got a lot of backlash or continue to get a lot of backlash for the kind of things that you talk about.
Yeah, I was really worried about that. I'm a people pleaser. I like everyone to be happy. And I had spent my life doing things that pleased people. I figured out at a very young age how you succeed in the world that I was raised in this
How
kind
you
of
fit in, yeah.
yeah, how do you fit in? How do you get praise? How do you get adults to say, "Wow, that's somebody I want my kid hanging out with." And I liked achievement and I liked being good. And so I figured out, hey, if you just follow the rules and you just do things well, people praise you and it makes life easier because you're just liked by people. And
Mm,
so when I got into this and began this journey of learning and found my own mind changing to support approaches I had never even considered before, I had actively opposed before, it felt really scary. It felt like the
mm,
rug getting ripped out from under me because none of us want to be confronted with something that pushes against what we have believed. As much as we
mhm,
like to think of ourselves as open-minded people, it is uncomfortable. There's no way around being uncomfortable when something you have supported gets challenged in a way that you actually find a little bit compelling. So it's one thing if you get challenged and you can immediately throw it in the crazy bucket. Yeah, that's crazy.
yeah,
I'm not even going to entertain whether or not that could be true. And that's what we do most of the time when we come across beliefs that are different than the ones that we hold. Say, I can't believe anybody
mm,
believes that. It's so crazy. We don't really entertain them. We don't really give them the time of day to think about why do other people believe that's true, even if I don't, and try to understand where they're
mm,
coming from. So for me, when I began to learn and began to see these ideas and find them compelling, I was very uncomfortable personally just to go through that destabilization of what is this gonna mean for me? What is this gonna change in my life? What other values is this going to touch on? It's very, um, disorienting because
mm,
we have made sense of our worlds in a little framework that makes sense to us, and when something new comes in, we're not sure exactly what all that's gonna change in our lives. We could think about that through the lens of the gospel. Somebody comes to faith, we don't know what all that's going to cost us. We don't know
sure.
where God's going to lead us. We don't know what parts of our lives he's going to convict us of that we didn't really want to give over in the beginning. And yet when we're walking with him, we're on a journey and it's going to keep taking us places that might still be
Mm,
uncomfortable. And so that was the feeling that I had in the beginning was just this discomfort and uncertainty over what is this going to mean for me and how do I put all of these new ideas into who I am as someone who is a believer, as someone who sees the role of government through a conservative lens? Like, what is that going to do? And so when I started talking about it publicly, I was literally shaking as I posted my first Facebook post about this change of mind away from a criminal justice approach to drugs and addiction towards a
yeah,
health-centered approach, thinking people are going to think I've lost my faith. That was the first thing. Wasn't just they're going to think I'm crazy, but they're going to think I'm not a Christian anymore because in the
mhm,
world I grew up in, and I'm from Mississippi, born and raised here, I've lived here my whole life. Um, eh, the the role of faith in politics was so tightly wound that
mhm,
it felt like to me anything that feels like it might be a move away from that is going to seem like I'm throwing out everything. And that wasn't at
right.
all what I was doing. And I wanted to help people see that you can learn new information and you can change your mind about the best way you think your values should be lived out. Didn't change my values. I changed the path that I think best reflects those values related to
Mm,
drugs and addiction. And my experience of people's response to that was overwhelmingly positive. And I think a large part of that is because in the very beginning I just had this I wasn't sure how you go about communicating something you're passionate about. Do you stick your
mhm.
flag in the ground and do you just get angry at everybody who disagrees with you? That didn't really feel
That's one way
like
to do it.
it's one way it's one way to do it. Is it
Just look at
winsome?
Twitter.
Is it effective? I don't think so, and I think
Yeah.
research bears that out. But there, I felt that sense of like, oh, I've learned something. I want to communicate it, and I want people to know how much I believe in it. So that pull towards this sort of activism. And yet, when I thought about my own journey of learning, what I came back to is the things that gave me the space to learn were the people who were very kind and just answered questions as I had them, offered resources, but didn't push, didn't shame, didn't blame, didn't tell me I
Yes.
was wrong. They just gave me a space to learn, and they equipped me with information to learn
Yeah.
and to come to my own conclusions. And that was incredibly powerful for me. And that's what I ended up doing. And it has been incredibly powerful for thousands of other people now who have joined this journey of rethinking how we've approached
Mm.
drugs and addiction so that we can save lives, help more families be healthy, and ultimately have safer communities too, which everybody wants.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think it's really a powerful thing to have people from different walks of life involved in this conversation. I'm just thinking about how, obviously it's so important, it's so essential that in this conversation we have people advocating that have had their lives, personally very impacted and affected by whether it's drug addiction, drug overdose, that sort of thing. But also to have folks on the other side of the equation that see the merit in this. I mean, I do think it's interesting coming at this conversation from a perspective of, like personally, I don't have a dog in this fight in
Hmm.
terms of like I'm not fighting for there to be there to be a decriminalization for drug possession because I want to do drugs or because I want
Right.
anybody to do drugs or like any of that. It's because I see the negative impact that it's having on society, that it's having on families, the destabilization of families and communities. I see that. I see that it's been going on forever. It's gotten worse. It hasn't gotten better. So at the very least, we need to re-examine the structures that are set up in place to just stop. Like, I don't want anybody, and I know you're the same, like I don't want people to be doing drugs, particularly the drugs that are addictive and right now are illegal, but particularly the drugs that are harmful to people's health. But we can't continue to look at the situation that's been perpetuated and pretend that the things that are being done to combat the crisis are actually really having any kind of a positive effect by and large, right?
Yeah.
And
So,
so I appreciate you and your bravery for like coming at this conversation and jumping into it the way that you have.
well, I think it's important too to highlight just how badly what we're doing is failing. Because I think if you're
Mm,
not close to it, maybe you're hearing some negative headlines, but you want to believe that what's happening is positive. I mean, all of us want to believe the things happening in the world are trending in the right direction.
yeah.
Um, if you look at rates of illegal drug use, they've doubled in the last 20 years. That is not heading in the right direction. We had more overdose deaths. We've had record highs. It's basically every year is creating a new record high of overdose deaths.
Mm,
Over 100,000 people dying every single year of
yeah.
preventable drug overdoses. So not trending in the right direction. And 1
Mm,
in 10 Americans have used an illegal drug recently. So if you just think about yourself at the grocery store, walking down the
mm,
aisles, 1 in 10. Illegal drugs. We're not talking about legal drugs
mhm,
or legal prescriptions they got from their doctor, even that they're misusing. We're talking about people buying drugs from somewhere that is not legal and using them. So just because you and I aren't using them doesn't mean a whole bunch of other people aren't using them. And that's exactly what's happening. So we might not see it in terms of I might not have somebody in my neighborhood who's actually standing on their street corner and I say, I know that guy's selling drugs. But the reality is that it's happening all around us all the time. And it's
yes.
getting worse as illegal drug use increases. The potency of those drugs is continuing to increase. The overdose deaths because of that is continuing to increase because there's no quality control on the underground market. So we're trending in the wrong direction.
Mhm.
We're going to need to change course somehow if we are going to move outcomes in a positive direction. So that's what we do at End It for Good. That's what the book Curious is all about. It's my story of learning what we could do differently that could save lives, um, and of inviting other people to consider, is that what we want to pursue? Because if you look at human history, all of us look back at the previous generations and we say,
Mhm.
"Gosh, how could they not see all the things that we can see now?" And
Yeah,
and we look back and we see all of these forward steps in human history, and each generation thought the previous generation was crazy for some of the stuff that they did.
absolutely. Mhm.
And so we have to be willing to say, there's some of that happening right now. There are things we are doing and partaking in today that our children and grandchildren are going to look back on and say, "How could you not see? How did you not change direction when you saw that wasn't working?" And I absolutely believe that how we have handled drugs and addiction is going to be one of those issues that our grandchildren look back on and say, "How could you arrest people for something that was a response to trauma and pain in their lives, and
Mm.
you put them in jail, which exposed them to more trauma and pain. When you had the research showing that addiction is driven by pain, why did you continue using a response that adds more pain into their life?" And that's what
Mm.
we got to grapple with. And we have to be willing to say, we've gotten some things right and we've gotten some things wrong. And maybe this is one of the ones we've gotten wrong. And the best thing we can do is to change course when we see that it needs to change, not to just continue on because it's what we've always done. We've got to be willing to say, you know what, change is painful. It's painful to
Mhm.
admit that we might have been part of things that were not helpful and potentially actually hurt people. But the best way is not to stick our head in the sand and say, we don't want to know. The best way is to say, how could we prevent harm from happening to the next generation of people
Yeah.
who are coming? And actually, I was giving a presentation, and this was to a group of master's students who were studying to be therapists. And there was a woman, and the way that I like to do presentations is I talk for about 30 minutes and then the rest of the time we spend in discussion. So we
Mhm.
wind our way around the room. Everybody has 1 minute to share what they think about the ideas that I've just presented, which we'll get into. And it got to her. She was the last person sitting on the back row. And she said, when I'm listening to you give this presentation, it makes me really sad. And my immediate thought was, "Oh no, I wasn't trying to make you sad. I was trying to show you that there's hope." And she said, "It makes me sad because I grew up with a father who was addicted to a number of different drugs, and he hid his addiction because he didn't want to get arrested for it. And so my childhood was marked by all sorts of chaos from my dad's addiction."
Mm.
And she said, "My dad just passed away recently from drug related
Mm.
causes. So when I hear you talk about the changes that we could make, it makes me sad because I think if we had made those when I was a kid, my entire life could have looked very different than it did."
Wow.
And that's what I think we have in front of us. Can we make the change so we can help people like Amanda who are being born today grow up in a world where their family members' addictions or their own addictions are handled in a way that reduces the level of harm that they experience rather than exacerbating it?
Mm. Wow. So Christina, let's back up a little bit, and I'd love to hear just a little bit about your story. Like, how did you get into this? Like, how did how
Yeah.
did you get into advocating for this?
Yeah. Um, I'm not the person you would think would be doing that. Like you, never used an illegal drug. I grew up in Mississippi in a wonderful Christian home. I never used drugs when I was in high school or college. I wasn't around it. It wasn't part of what my friends
Mhm.
did. I was homeschooled kindergarten through high school. Then I went to a Christian liberal arts university and got a degree in Bible. Still just was not part of my world and continued not to be part of my world until I was in my early 30s. And my husband and I became foster parents. And through that experience,
Mm.
we fostered a little baby who came to us straight from the hospital after he was born. And his mom had been using drugs while she was pregnant. So he was removed from her custody.
Mm.
So he came to us, and the only way that I had to understand that situation is his mom must not really love him that much if she was using
Yeah.
drugs while she was pregnant. I couldn't,
Yeah.
I had two boys myself. I just could not fathom how that could be. And so I brought him, Beckham, the baby, I brought him to his first visit with his mom at the child welfare office a couple of days after he came to live with us. And I pulled into the parking lot and popped his car seat out of my car and turned around to walk in the building. And there's this woman running towards me, weeping. And she runs
Hmm.
over and she just starts kissing this little baby and
Yeah.
talking to him. And this is Joanne, his mom.
Yeah.
And I wish that I could say I felt this immense compassion and wow, this is incredible. But really, it just felt confusing to me. And I feel like oftentimes when we encounter something that doesn't fit with what we are expecting, we just get suspicious. We look for ways to discount it or discredit it. And so my
Hmm.
thought process was, I don't think this can be real. And so maybe she's just trying to get me to put in a good word with the social worker. And I talked with her on the phone a couple of times, but and still I'm hearing this mom who loves her son, but in my mind, I'm thinking, but he's in foster care, which means he's better off with me and he's not safe with you. And
Hmm.
you're using drugs. And what I believe about that is people who use drugs are bad people. So that means you're a bad person. So it was
Wow.
lots of conflict over this experience with her that's coming up against all of what I have picked up from the culture about people like her. And so went to I let her have her 1 hour visitation with him, and I went to a park with my other kids and came back and picked him up. And he came back to our house with me, and I tell that story in more detail in the book Curious, but he came back to our house and she left for inpatient drug treatment, and she would call me from treatment and say, "Can you put me on speakerphone?" And she would sing to him over the phone.
Hmm.
And the more that I got to know her, the more I realized she is a mom like me. She does love her son as much as I love my three boys. And, her addiction is not a lack of love for her son. It is
Right.
this very serious health crisis that she's dealing with.
Right.
And maybe it's also a spiritual crisis and a mental health crisis. There could be lots of things involved in that.
Sure.
But I had this thought that, wait a second, what what would happen then if she had gotten picked up by the police rather than being able to go to the treatment center where she was at, getting the help that she needed to deal with the reasons why she was using
Hmm.
um, those drugs? Because drug use is it's a response, it's a solution attempt at other
Absolutely.
things. So we have been told drugs are the problem. Drugs aren't the
Hmm.
problem. They're a solution attempt at a deeper problem.
Hmm.
And until we can shift our focus to responding in a way that actually helps people deal with that underlying cause, we're going to continue to get negative outcomes because you can take drugs away from someone and they'll shift to something else. Until we can find that healing, until they can find that healing for the reasons why they're using, that coping mechanism of numbing is going to continue to be there. And there's no way to take away all the drugs from all the people in the world. I was actually just talking to somebody yesterday who had spent some time incarcerated, and he said, "Oh yeah," he said, "drugs are cheaper and more available in jail than they are out in the free world." I said, "Yeah, that's what I've heard. A lot of people who've spent time incarcerated have said that. It's so easy. It's right there." He said, "Yeah, we got once a week we would get chicken, and you could trade 2 pieces of chicken for drugs. And that way you didn't even
Wow.
have to have money. You could just trade food that other people wanted, and that would get you it." There's also this complicated system of getting family members to put money on these cards, and the numbers of the cards can be transferred between people incarcerated. It's a whole
Wow. Yeah.
system of buying and selling within the prison system. And so I think it's worth thinking about that we can't keep drugs out of a maximum security prison. They are readily available and sold there. And yet we are continuing this approach to try to eradicate them in the free world. Um, and it doesn't work in either place. And we need to shift our approach if we want to get better outcomes.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that you kind of touched on there is the shift in perspective of a health-based approach as
Hmm.
opposed to a criminalized approach, right? And so what do you think that that would look like? Or in order for this to for us to start taking steps in the right direction, what do you think are maybe some of the beginning things or even the low-hanging fruit of some of the first initial steps that really need to be taken so that we can actually start helping more people or getting more people on the right track as opposed to just kind of like coming down hard? I think as you were talking, I was thinking there about how it's really easy a lot of times. It's much easier many times in our daily lives to gravitate toward a lack of empathy and a lack of compassion because it just makes our lives easier. Like if I don't have to feel what that person is going through and I could just kind of numb myself or blind myself to the actual suffering that's going on there, and I can just kind of have that preconceived idea that this person is messed up. This person is making bad decisions. This person, as you said, that thought process, this person must not love their kid if they're choosing to partake of that substance while they're pregnant or whatever. And I think that when we approach these kinds of it's a public health crisis more than it is in a lot of sense more than it is like a
Hmm.
criminal behavior, you know what I'm saying? And
Yeah.
so but it's easier for society, for people in general to kind of sit back and to think about it with that lack of compassion because then it doesn't affect them personally. And I think one of the most important things that you and other voices like you are putting out into the world today is this thing that says, no, 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 like this is not okay for you to ignore just because maybe you haven't at this point in your life been personally affected by it. Because I think that we've got to start at least from that place of having compassion for people that are struggling and that are suffering. Part of that is understanding what this really is, that this isn't as you said, this isn't just a bunch of people that just want to do drugs because they don't care about anything else. It's like, no, like this is there's a real like public health crisis. As you said, some of it is mental health, some of it is it's all kinds of things going on, but we can't be so quick to judge and just separate ourselves from this thing that is plaguing just so much of society today if we really want to see change. And as you said, just sticking people in prison for it and whatever, like that's not fixing the problem. It's exacerbating the problem in a large number of these cases because it's not actually helping people to be better. It's not helping people to deal with, as you said, the underlying root causes of why these drug problems exist. Why is this supply, excuse, yeah, not the supply, but why is the demand for this so high? And beginning to look at some of those more just personal issues and community issues and societal issues and systemic issues and things that are going on in communities, in families, in the lives of people that are leading to these things. What does it look like to begin to make that shift, right? Like, what does it look
Yeah.
like to begin to shift this to more of a health centered, a health based approach to dealing with the addiction problem and the
Hmm.
drug problem as opposed to just criminalizing everything.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think it's helpful to take that in three parts. And I'll quickly walk through why the current approach doesn't work so that I can explain why a different approach would work.
Please.
So if you look at, so we've been talking about people who are using drugs, but let's zoom out even further than that to look at the whole issue of how we handle drugs, because it's part of the way that we fix crime and it's part of the way we fix the overdose crisis, which are top of mind for a lot of people, even if, like you said, even if they don't feel like they're personally impacted by addiction in some way.
Mhm.
So when you look at what is happening with drug markets. When you have a market that operates in a legal, regulated market, it's not marked by crime and violence. You look at the alcohol market or the cannabis market in states where it's legal. Now, you might not like either of those things. I don't use either one, but the market, you don't see people who own a liquor store, going down the street and killing the people who own a neighboring liquor store. That doesn't
Mm,
happen. Those markets are operating in a legal, regulated way. If they have a problem with one another, they take it to the court system. You have business people who own those businesses, not people who are engaging in criminal activity and creating crime in the community. But what happens when you take markets for popular drugs, which we have for many different drugs, and you force them out of that legal economy, they don't go away. They just move underground. So you have
mm,
massive influx of cash into criminal organizations. So gangs, cartels, terrorist organizations, all of them are primarily funded through the money that comes from drug prohibition, from forcing some of these drug markets underground. So if you think about crime, every time we prohibit a new drug that people want to use, it incentivizes and creates more crime, not less crime, more
mm,
crime, because it's giving more of a market share, more cash flow into people who are breaking the law. And how do you get more and more of that cash? Well, you take out your competitors, you consolidate power. You don't do that through the court system in an underground market, you do it through force. And that creates a lot of crime and violence in our streets, all around our communities. If you look at the root causes of so much of crime, it is related to this underground drug market that's playing out all around us. And so we would love to see those markets begin to shift back towards legally regulated markets. Now that doesn't mean candy aisle. It means let's look at the potential harm of each particular drug and develop a regulatory structure that might work best for it. We already have done that with
mhm.
tobacco, with alcohol, with cannabis, with prescription drugs. There's all different ways that we already have developed regulatory structures for drugs to move those markets legal instead of into this free for all underground crime laced market.
Yeah.
Um,
Can I pause you for a
yeah.
second? So what you're talking about is would be moving beyond just a decriminalization to an actual legalization, right? Which is a little bit stronger. It's not just a matter of I'm not going to go to jail for possessing. It's actually I can go somewhere that's a legitimate source to obtain this, which was once an illegal substance.
Mhm.
What we much like what we've seen with cannabis, marijuana over the
Yep.
past several years in many, many states, right? So
Yes. Yep. That's a great point. Two different things. One is kind of dealing with consumer. Is drug possession a crime? The other is dealing with the market for the drugs that they're buying and whether or not it's operating legally or operating in this underground market. So that's a great point. So on the crime front, underground markets create a lot of crime. They incentivize crime and they give people a lot of money to engage in other sorts of crime by the amount of money the underground market is making off of these drugs.
mm,
So on the one hand, it incentivizes crime to make drugs illegal, but it also is the reason why we have the overdose crisis that we have today,
yes.
because on an underground market, there is no quality control. People can sell whatever they want to, and the incentive is to make those drugs as potent as possible. I'll give you an example of this that people always smile because they have seen this happen. If you think about alcohol, if you go to a sports stadium where alcohol is prohibited on the inside, what you
Mhm,
see when people are tailgating before they go in is that people are drinking beer. But when they go inside and prohibition has started at those gates, they begin drinking hard liquor on the inside. It's
mm,
not because their tastes have changed.
yeah.
It's because prohibition started. And are they going to take the risk of smuggling a six pack of
Right.
beer?
Yeah, it's harder
No.
to fit a six-pack under your
Right.
shirt than a
Right. You're just
bottle of
gonna smuggle
Jack or
your flask.
whatever.
Right. Not because you particularly want that, but because prohibition is always going to incentivize the biggest punch in the smallest package because there's
Mhm,
risk associated with moving that drug. So if regular people at a college stadium are making that decision, and they're responding to the forces of prohibition by upping the potency of the drug that they're using. It is completely understandable and predictable that the manufacturers of drugs on the underground market are going to be doing the exact same thing. They're also taking risk by smuggling these drugs. They want to get the biggest punch in the smallest
Mm.
package. And so what you have is this very dangerous cocktail of high potency drugs with no
Yes.
regulation, no quality control. So now we have fentanyl, which is an understandable response to the forces of prohibition. You can smuggle a suitcase of fentanyl and it can get millions of people high.
Mhm.
Or you could smuggle, an entire shipload of heroin and it can get millions of people high. It it is a response that is creating this overdose crisis that we have because now more than 90% of people who are dying have fentanyl in their systems when they die. They're not
Yes.
getting medical grade fentanyl from their doctor. They're getting random whatever they happen to buy on the
Stepped
street.
on, yeah.
Yes, and it
Yeah.
just is causing so many people to die.
Can you explain fentanyl to me? Because so it seems like, because I fully understand what you're saying. That's a perfect analogy. The sports game, from tailgating to going inside the stadium, you have to smuggle something, so it has to be more potent. It does make sense that the same thing would happen in the illegal drug market. But fentanyl seems like, I mean, it's so much more potent than traditional heroin or whatever. It's so much more deadly. Like, such a small amount can kill somebody. I believe fentanyl is now, is it the number one leading cause of death for, is it folks age 18 to 49? I think is the statistic that I've heard recently.
Yeah, so overdose is
Fentanyl
the
overdoses.
Yeah, overdose is the number one accidental cause of death in the United States
Mhm.
now, and now more than 90% of those are caused by fentanyl. So,
Our
yes.
fentanyl. So, like, what is that? Because that seems like an overcorrection to me, and I'm having a hard
Mhm.
time wrapping my mind around why they're producing so much fentanyl if they're essentially, like, they know they're gonna be killing their customers. Like, I don't know, do you know, like, what the dynamic is that's going on there? Like, why it's that potent and why it's ending up it just inside of, so many, like, other drugs that they're not expecting it to be fentanyl. Um
Yeah. So the root cause is the same, that there is this push towards higher potency.
Mhm.
But
Is it
the
cheaper to produce? Is it
Yeah, it's very cheap to produce. You can
because
do it in a
it's
lab. So,
artificial, right? Yeah.
yes, you don't actually have to
Yeah.
grow a poppy plant or anything like that. You can produce it in a lab, you can produce it out on the open plains out, if you've got a lot of land. So it's very cheap to produce, it's highly potent, and it fits that bill. Now, the challenge is that because you don't have quality control, you don't know what actually happens to that fentanyl over the course of its life cycle to get from producer to consumer. So you do, if you produce alcohol, it's going to be the same product that leaves the manufacturing facility, and when it hits the consumer it's going to be the same thing. But that's not true with other drugs. They go through many different iterations often. Somebody who's producing it is selling it to someone else. They might add a bunch of other stuff to it, or they might buy what they know is a concentrated amount of it, and they think they
Mhm.
add enough to it to make it non-lethal.
To mitigate,
And
yeah.
then, yeah, then they sell it to somebody else. They might add other things into it. They sell it to somebody else. They might add other things to it. So you have no
Okay.
idea what's actually getting to the consumer. But also, and I think this is a really important point, fentanyl is not always lethal. The introduction of fentanyl into the underground drug market has created a market for fentanyl now. There are people who seek out fentanyl. That is their drug of choice and the drug that they're addicted to. They don't want to buy heroin, they want to buy fentanyl. So there are lots of people now who are actively, proactively buying fentanyl on purpose because that's what they want to
Mhm.
use. But it, any drug is, whether or not it causes an overdose is a combination of a lot of different factors. You could have two people using the exact same amount of drug out of the exact same amount of batch, or out of the exact same batch. And one of them's body chemistry may be such that it metabolizes it in a way that gets them high. The other
Hmm.
person might have body chemistry that metabolizes it in a way that is too much for them. It suppresses their breathing and leads to um, what we call an overdose, which is really just a respiratory failure. They stop breathing because
Yeah.
the depressant effect on their respiratory system is too great. Instead of just making them feel relaxed, it is actually causing them to stop breathing. Or it could be that somebody was actually had a couple of beers earlier in the evening. Then they went to use this other drug. The combination of drugs, most people who die from an overdose have a combination of drugs in their system. So
Mm.
it might not have actually even been the fentanyl that killed them. If they had used that
Wow.
on its own, it might have been fine. It might have just gotten them high. But because they were using X, Y, and Z earlier in the evening and it was still in their body, that's what actually led to the overdose, not particularly the fentanyl itself. It just has a much lower the margin of error is just razor thin with
Yes.
fentanyl. So
Okay.
there's not a lot of wiggle room. So both of those challenges, the crime problem with underground markets and the contamination problem with underground markets, can only be dealt with by bringing those markets back into some sort of legal, regulated fashion, which makes me very uncomfortable. I'll just be honest
Hmm.
about that.
Right.
As somebody who doesn't use and doesn't want other people using, that's just uncomfortable. I wish it would work, that we could just ban things we think are potentially harmful and they just sort of went away and there was no harm associated with it. But that is not the real world of what's happening. What's happening is south of our border, entire countries are being destabilized because of the violence and the corruption that the underground market has given cartels the ability to create in an entire country
Mm.
to be able to
Yeah.
destabilize it. And so many people dying of overdose. And if we're going to meaningfully address those two challenges, the the role of the underground drug market has to be meaningfully minimized. And unfortunately, the only way to do that is by allowing consumers to move back into purchasing from legal regulated markets instead, because as long as consumers are spending money, people are going to keep producing whatever those consumers want. Demand
Mm.
always drives supply. And we have millions and millions of people that want to buy drugs that are currently illegal, and they will continue to buy them. Um,
Yeah.
so we can't force them not to, but we can make it much less dangerous for them, much less likely that they're going to die, which is going to give them an opportunity to make healthier choices and to stay alive.
So this is a this is a sticky conversation, right? Because envisioning a world in which an adult, I would imagine it'd be the kind of scenario where they'd
Yeah.
be 21 or older, the same way that alcohol is set up, going into a store or going somewhere where they're able to legally purchase heroin, right? And so you can say the normal pushback on this would be, well, there's going to be people that never would have done drugs because they didn't want to go to an illegal source to get it. There's going to be people that are going to do drugs that would not have otherwise done drugs. There will be people that will get addicted to a substance that otherwise maybe would have gone their whole life without ever even trying that substance, right? So I think that's like the normal pushback of this conversation. Again, as the disclaimer, like I don't want anybody to do drugs, other than in situations where you need it for your health, for pain,
Right.
for
Right.
whatever. But I think that's the normal pushback on this, right? It's dealing with that reality that there will be people and maybe people will get addicted that otherwise wouldn't have. And so we're dealing with that aspect of this, which is where I think that this conversation gets a little bit tricky. But at the same time, it's putting something like that in place in order to mitigate this epidemic of a crisis that's going on in our world today with all of these people that, I mean, it seems like you mentioned 1 in 10 American adults have tried an illegal substance. Would you say recently?
Recently. Mhm.
Recently.
That's the US
So
government's term. That's not my term. That's their term. They say recently.
recently, defined recently, yeah. So it seems like most people, and again, but not everybody, but it seems like most of the people that want to get their hands on drugs, like they'll find a way
Mhm.
to do it. Like they'll find a
Yeah.
way to find their way to that substance.
Yeah.
The good thing about having it be more regulated, one of the good things about it would be if there's an age limit on it, then it wouldn't be kids getting their hands on it. We could maybe crack down on this stuff becoming so readily available in the school system and things like that. My question is there a is it really possible at this point to put that genie back in the bottle in terms of you're talking about the potency, and with illegal substances, prohibition essentially always leading to substances being produced in a more potent form. Would there still be a market for people that want something that's more dangerous, that want
Mm.
something that's more potent? You know what I'm saying?
Yep. Yep.
Because we see that it's going that way. We see people that are just so interested, they're so hooked on that high that they know they're going to get from something like fentanyl, that they're willing to take that risk knowing that this next dose could be their last.
Mhm. Mhm.
You know what I'm saying? And so, like, it seems to me like this has been going on for so long that, if we were to create this legally regulated version of this stuff for people to do recreationally or whatever, that there would still be a segment of the market that would exist for those instances where people just they want to party a little bit harder, they want to
Mhm.
go a little bit further, or they want something that is cheaper, or they want something that's whatever. So
Yeah.
I don't know, like
Yep.
what do you think about, I mean, I think these are just kind of the normal kind of
Mhm.
pushbacks to this
Yep.
conversation.
Absolutely. So I'll answer that two ways. One, I'd encourage people to read Curious because I split out in chapter on how do I think about this as a mom. My oldest son is 15. I have three boys. I'm thinking about this now for my own kids. How do I
Yeah,
keep
me
them
too.
safest? So thinking about it as a mom, thinking about it as a Christian, thinking about it as somebody who's conservative, thinking about it as, is this just helping one segment of people and costing everybody else? And so I encourage people, if there's something about this conversation that piques your curiosity, but you feel like this could never possibly work for all these thousand reasons, I'm going to encourage you to read the book, not because it's going to answer all of your questions, but because I hope it gives you a little bit of a new framework to think about it
Mm,
through and to continue that conversation, continue looking at different solutions. And so one of the things that was really helpful to me, and this is kind of, I'll shift to the second point of thinking about the potency and demand and people, like you've got all these people that are buying drugs on the street and e- like you said, how, I mean, would they actually shift to moving like to buying something legally, and would it just be something really potent and they just want to party harder? And so it's helpful to think about alcohol.
mm,
Alcohol prior to alcohol prohibition, low potency alcohol was the most popular forms of alcohol on the market. During Prohibition, high potency became the most popular. I mean, you couldn't get low potency anymore because people had to risk.
it's too expensive.
It was
Yeah,
too
yeah, yeah, yeah,
expensive, and
yeah,
so
yeah.
people are drinking high potency alcohol. Alcohol prohibition ends. People go back to drinking mostly low potency alcohol. And now you think about alcohol in
Hmm,
our day, and I don't drink it's just because I don't prefer the taste of alcohol, but it's been really interesting to me to see this emergence of not just beer, which is the most popular form of alcohol. It's a low potency form of alcohol. People could drink Jack Daniels all day long, but most
sure.
people don't because they don't want to get hammered. They want to just have a beer when they come home from work. So, similarly, even 100 years later, low potency alcohol continues to be the most popular form of
Hmm.
alcohol that people drink. But now there's this other this new culture. I'm not sure that it's particularly healthy. I'm not saying that it is. It's just to the point of low potency that now you have all of these seltzer drinks. that are even they're low potency alcohol. And
Mhm.
now they're showing up in places like kids' birthday parties for adults who want to have a little something to drink while they're mingling with the other parents at the kids' birthday parties. Again, not sure,
Mhm.
not saying that that's a healthy part of culture to bring alcohol into more functions, but just to say that the the alcohol market helps us to understand that the majority of people who use a particular drug want to use a low potency version. And that was true even of heroin and cocaine. So they have only been criminalized for about 100 years. Prior to that, heroin and cocaine were both legal in the United
Right.
States. But the most popular forms of them were their lowest potency forms. The most popular
Mm.
forms of cocaine were coca tea that people would drink, similarly to like a
Yeah.
strong cup of coffee. The most popular form of heroin was in over the counter soothing syrups that people would use
Mhm.
if they were dealing with anxiety. And we look back at that and say, what? You could buy heroin over the counter? Yes,
Yeah.
you could. It was low
They used to give
potency.
cocaine to babies
Yeah, they
for
did.
for
They
their
did.
teeth.
It was. And you look at those commercials like that, the visuals of the commercials, and it's just mind-blowing.
It's
And
nuts.
yet that was at the time, it was all low potency, and it certainly there were some people who became addicted to it. It was a very small number. And that's still very counterintuitively true today. Most people who use even drugs like heroin and cocaine do not become addicted to them. They use them
Mm.
either for a short period in their life, or they just use them if they go to a party. And the rest of the time,
Mm.
they're working and, raising their kids or whatever they're doing. And we don't see that because it's hidden, because it's illegal. But the data has shown that out for years and years, that the vast majority of people who use any drug don't become addicted to it, similarly to
Right.
most people
Okay.
who use alcohol. So I think there's some valid fears, particularly for your point of more people would probably use drugs. And I would say, yes, I think you're right. I think there are some people who are going to use, I think you've seen that with cannabis. So more young
Right.
people don't use cannabis if it's legal for adults. We've seen
Right.
that, but more adults do use cannabis if it's legal for adults.
Mhm.
And yet we see that even though use rates are increasing, these other harms are decreasing. There's less
Mm.
cannabis on the underground market. There's far fewer people being arrested for any sort of cannabis crime. So I'm always wanting to look at the biggest picture possible, not one bar on the bar graph, but the whole bar graph. We got to look at
Mm.
crime. We got to look at overdose. We have to look at families and children, and what does it do to children who grow up in communities that are racked by violence, who are losing parents to overdose. It's increasing their own trauma and risk of addiction. So
Mhm.
it's not just access that increases people's, risk of use.
Yeah.
It is all of these other features of what the
Right.
drug market does to their life. And I think that's what
Hmm.
has convinced me so completely that this could work. Not that it's going to be painless. It's going to be painful.
Yes.
You don't get away
Yeah.
from failed policy without a good deal of pain. But it's at least pain in service to
Mhm.
better outcomes rather than pain that's continuing to lead us to poor outcomes.
That's so good, and it seems to me that, maybe and I again, there's not one answer, right, that's
Mhm.
gonna that's gonna fix
Correct.
everything,
Yes.
but if some of the funds, like what we've seen in Portugal, right? So, so if some of the funds that are currently being directed toward incarcerating people, toward cracking down on people that are possessing illegal drugs and that sort of thing. Like if a lot of the funds that we're allocating to that side of this issue right now were repositioned to begin to focus more on some of more of the underlying causes, right? Like how we can actually help people get out of these situations, not just to get unaddicted from drugs, but to begin to sow into like the infrastructure of communities and areas that where we see a lot of the problem being perpetuated, right? Like it's across
Mhm.
the board. It's not just in like lower income areas that we see addiction. Of course not, absolutely not. But I do think that
They just have less
there
money to
are.
hide it. That's all that's going
Yeah,
on there.
exactly,
It's
exactly.
happening absolutely in high income communities. They're just a little bit more able
Absolutely.
to hide it.
Absolutely, absolutely. Like I lived in Mexico for 3 years as a missionary, and it wasn't uncommon for me to like be driving to church in the morning and like see people on the side of the road drinking, like rubbing alcohol,
Mm,
right? Like just drinking whatever they can get their hands on to perpetuate, their that feeling that they for to get through that problem, whatever that underlying issue is that they're having in their life that they're trying to block or mask, or whatever the case is. But they're just getting their hands on whatever they can find, whatever they can afford. And so that's where I think that, that issue of, even if we were to kind of like begin to clean this whole thing up, there would still be an area of the market where there would be people that the whether we're talking about the cartels, criminal enterprises, could prey upon, people in those situations that are still going to, they're going to want to find a way to get their hands on this kind of stuff. But I think that like beginning to reposition some of the funds that are going into other areas and kind of sowing into different areas of society and communities in particular, to like build up these communities. One of the things that you talk about in your book is the whole rat park thing, right? And that's such an interesting case study of what can happen. And again, it's with rats, right? But but rats are social animals and that sort of thing. And that whole kind of study that was done that looked at what can happen when you are essentially putting, in this case, a rat in a cage, and they don't have access to things that are going to make them feel good and feel connected and that sort of thing. And so they're going to gravitate more toward the substance that's going to alter their state of mind, right? But would you explain that a little bit and just kind of mention just that experiment a little bit and like some of the key takeaways from the whole
mhm.
rat park thing? I think that's a
Yeah.
really interesting, connection.
Yeah, I think that's a great explanation of that third piece. So we kind of talked about the market piece and then the substance piece, of prohibition creating so many extra harms. But the consumer piece, the big question is, does incarceration actually help people stop using
Mm,
drugs? Because if it
right.
did, even if you didn't like it, you could at least make the case that it works. So
Hmm.
what Rat Park did, it was done back in the 1970s by a professor named Dr. Bruce Alexander. And he was a young professor at that time. And he was working he had been assigned to work at an addiction treatment center. And as he talked with the people that he was working with, he realized, wait a second, all these people are telling me about the reasons they're using drugs, and it doesn't have anything to do with the drug. It has to do with trauma in their childhood, of being abused, of the loneliness that they
Yeah.
feel, of the lack of
Yeah.
community. And so being part of this sort of underground drug culture is giving them a place to belong and people to belong to. And so he went to his students that he was also teaching and said, "Hey, I'm learning all of these different things in the clinic with my clients." And the student said, "Well, that can't be true, because these experiments were just done with rats, where you put them in these boxes. They're called Skinner boxes. And you give them access to pushing a lever that can give them regular water, or you can give them heroin or cocaine laced water. And you put
Hmm.
the rats in the boxes and they just push the levers and with the drug laced water until they eventually overdose and die. So, see, this is what
It's
these drugs
wild.
do to you."
Yeah. Yeah.
And Dr. Alexander looked at those experiments and he said, "Well, but Skinner boxes they're these small boxes. There's nothing to do in them and they're isolated. So you're just putting a rat. It's basically like a similar scenario to putting a person in solitary confinement. There's a small
Mm.
space. They're put in there by themselves. Nothing to do, no community, no nothing." And he
So question, was the experiment initially done with to show that, was the experiment originally set up to just see like which lever
Mhm.
the rat is
Yes.
gonna gravitate toward without even thinking about the environment that
Correct.
he was in, right? So
Yes.
the initial conclusions are like, "Oh, he's just gonna gravitate toward the lever with the heroin because that's what he wants. So
That's what he wants.
that's what they're
Yeah.
gonna go after." Okay,
Right.
gotcha.
So Dr. Alexander looks at that and he says, wait a second. Rats are similar to humans in that they're incredibly social creatures.
Mhm.
So I wonder what would happen if we put a rat in an environment that they were actually happy in, where they had
Yeah.
little rat friends and where they had
Mhm.
toys and they had sawdust and
A
all the
life.
things that
Yeah.
make for a little rat happy life. So they created that on the floor of one of their labs at the university, and he and several colleagues, they put the rats in it with all the things they could ever want to be happy in a little rat world. And what they found is that the rats hardly ever pushed the lever for the drug laced solution, and
Mm.
they never used it excessively. Every now and then they would go and use it, but never to overdose, never to excess.
Mm.
And he began this 50-year journey of his career of rethinking that approach that says the drugs are the driver and instead maybe the cage
Mm.
is the driver, and the
Wow.
drugs are just the coping mechanism for whatever cage that rat happens to be in. If he's in a happy place, he doesn't need the drugs. If he's in a place where everything that's meaningful to a rat is taken away, yeah, he's going to use the drug laced water. And you can't do that kind of experiment on humans because it would be inhumane. But he spent the next 50 years trying to
You could have done it
research.
in the '60s. You could have got away. You could
Yeah,
have you got
he
away
got
with it
away
back
with a
then.
lot then. Um, just trying to research in all the ways that he could, and in just continuing to talk with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of clients who came through his practice to understand, is that true? And his 50 years of research, along with many other people, have shown that yes, that's what's really happening for people. It is
Mm.
much less about the drug. And I was actually talking to a therapist who today specializes in treating people with addiction. And he says, for a lot of my clients who are addicted to a drug, if you go back in their history, the first thing they were addicted to is food. It's their first experience,
Wow.
usually as a child, of using a substance as a coping mechanism for whatever was going on in their life. So
Mm.
even if you take someone's drug of choice away, unless you deal with the underlying reasons, they'll move to something else. They'll pick up a different drug of choice. Um, and somebody told me, it's not a win if you get somebody who's an alcoholic and you just get them to stop drinking alcohol, but they start punching holes in their walls in their house. Like, they can say that they're sober. That doesn't mean that they're
Mhm.
healthy. That's
Yes.
We want health. We want them to be healthy, whether or not they're using a substance. We focus so much on the substance that we now consider, if you're abstinent, hooray, and if you're not,
Mhm.
then you're not getting it. And instead, I really think we need to shift to thinking, how can we help someone heal from whatever is causing the pain in their life, and focus less on whether or not and what they're using, and all of that has become so much our focus that we often don't ask that deeper question. We just
Mm.
try to look at the behavior modification on one behavior instead of saying, "Hey, how can we holistically help this person to find a healthy life?" And for me as a believer, find who God made them to be, help them to live into that identity as
It's
a
really good.
child of God and as somebody who is made in his image and has incredible worth and value. So when I look at incarceration and I look at what we know now about the causes of addiction, it just breaks my heart. It is so sad to me that we are using trauma to try to solve a problem that is made worse by
Mm.
trauma. We have,
Wow.
a person every now and then who says jail is the best thing, it saved my life.
Sure.
Now, number one, that person is generally not saying that while they're in jail. They had some very short stint of incarceration that,
Yes.
oh, well, now that was just the thing I needed, but I'm really glad that I'm now living the life I want to live on the outside
Yeah.
with my family. The reality is that for many, many, many people, jail and prison only makes their lives even harder. Um, so a different person
Mm.
I was talking to yesterday, the the person who told me about chicken in jail and being able to trade that for drugs, just a few minutes later, I was talking to a totally different person, different conversation. They didn't even know I had been talking to the other person. And he said, "Hey, I heard about your new book." He said, I got I had a felony, or I had a cocaine addiction back
Mhm.
in the early days of my life. I got a felony for that
Mm.
32 years ago. And for 32 years, it has blocked me out of employment opportunity.
Jeez.
He said,
Yeah.
even just 4 years ago, I tried to go. I thought maybe I can go like do get a license to be like an 18-wheeler driver, truck driver. And
Mhm.
so he said 4 years ago, I went and applied, got all the way through the end of the process. I was the top person that they were looking at. Um, and at the very end, they said, "Do you have any felonies?" And he said, "Yeah, but it was 28 years ago for, this
Jeez.
cocaine addiction that I was struggling with."
Yeah.
And they came back to him and they said, "I'm sorry, we can't let you go through the program because of your felony conviction." So that's what we have. And we have an incredible amount of people who have been impacted in that way, who aren't saying this is the best thing that ever happened. Instead, for 30 years, it has been a ball and chain around their leg that has kept them out
Mm.
of being able to provide, being able to take opportunity and to live what most of us want, which is for people to be able to go do build a life, build a career, provide for themselves, be happy and productive and contributing. And he's done that in many other ways, but not in the ways that he wanted, and without a lot of the opportunities that many of us just take for granted, that we could go get a license for truck driving if we wanted to. And yet something
Yeah.
he did 30 years ago is continuing
It's
to
unreal.
be a barrier.
Yeah, it's unreal. That's such a seems like such a massive just oversight in our world
Hmm.
today that we could still be today operating based on that. It just seems like such obsolete data that
Hmm.
we're using to just essentially judge people, condemn people, keep people stuck, keep people trapped. And it seems like that aspect of this seems like it just seems so correctable.
Hmm.
Like it seems like that element of this at least is part of this that we could actually correct,
Yeah.
without even throwing a whole lot of money at it or
Right.
whatever.
Yeah, which goes to your point of
Um,
kind of solutions. There are solutions other than these kind of big picture solutions of moving drugs back into legally regulated markets. That's a
yeah.
big deal, and that would happen over many years, step by
Yes.
step, trying out things in one small location, seeing what works, moving to other places. But there are things like making drug convictions automatically expunged. That could
Mm,
massively open up employment opportunity for
yeah.
people, even if a community is not ready to stop arresting people for those drug offenses in the beginning. Just making it not hold them back for the rest of their lives on the back end, that's one step we could take. There are
Now to
lots
be
of those
clear,
kind of
we're
steps.
differentiating between, drug possession charges and,
Mhm.
drug trafficking charges, right? Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, you could definitely. So there's kind of a whole spectrum. You could say, "Hey, on possession charges, we're gonna do X, Y, and Z," because really
Mhm.
it's just there's no evidence that they were doing anything that could have been harmful to anyone else. It's just they were in possession of a drug we don't want them to be in possession of.
Mhm.
Then you could do something totally different on drug selling or trafficking. And that's really where the shift away from that criminalized market comes in. It's not so much that we don't think people should be arrested for breaking the law, because we do. We just think there's some things that have been criminalized that are not actually helping us to
Mhm.
criminalize.
Yeah.
And for people who are, let's say, in states where cannabis is legal and there's a legal market there, it's appropriate for law enforcement to arrest people who are selling cannabis illegally
Mm.
there, because they're
Right.
not
Right.
participating in that new legal market. Now, some states have made it nearly impossible to participate in it by high regulations, high taxation.
Right.
There can be definite problems there, but we would want to see the criminal justice system being empowered to, when they are arresting people, it is actually improving public safety. It's improving the community. And right now we
Mm,
have, here in Mississippi, drug possession is the number one reason why people are sent to prison. It's not for trafficking, it's not
man.
for selling, it's not for intent to sell, it's not for murder, theft, anything else. Drug possession is the
Wow.
charge that the highest number of people are being sent to prison for. So even if we just started there and began to roll that back a little bit, it would have a massive impact on lots and lots of families, which, how we handle families affects every one of us because it's the bedrock of our communities.
Now, our country leads the world in incarcerations, number of, people incarcerated, right? I think the most cynical viewpoint on this conversation would be that there's an incentivization to not decriminalize, because there's people out there that actually profit from people being imprisoned. I was surprised to find out, because I just had no idea that so many of the corporations that we interact with on a daily basis are involved in, what I would term that prison industrial complex.
Mm,
Like people like, McDonald's and Wendy's, all the way to some of the, most popular airlines out there, companies like Starbucks, and telecommunication companies, and just like all kinds of companies that are kind of involved in this thing. And I don't know whether it's all bad or not, if it's all expletive or not, but it does seem that there are, people out there in society that are profiting off of our prison systems having more people in them.
mhm.
So I don't know. That's a very cynical approach to this. Is that an aspect of this? Do you think that comes into play?
Yes, it absolutely comes into play because every business or system that is involved in the criminal justice system, almost everyone has a lobbying arm. So that's true
Ah,
for law enforcement. There's sheriff's associations, police chiefs associations, all kinds
yeah.
of law enforcement associations. Then there's associations for businesses that provide services to prisons. So you think about all the different businesses that provide food for prisons, that provide
Right.
uniforms, that provide phone services or video chats for people who are incarcerated. And so I look at that and say, I'm willing to give the vast majority of people the benefit of the doubt and say they believe what they're doing is helping people. They believe that people need to be incarcerated if they're not acting
Mhm.
right. Um, whether or not that's really a public safety issue or not, we have just been told that. I mean, I believed that, and it wasn't because I was benefiting financially from it. I just thought,
Right.
this is the right thing to do. It's what society has told me is the right thing to do, and people that I love, I hear kind of supporting this, and so yeah, I bet this is right. We need to use the criminal justice system. And there are a lot of painful things that happen in the world and a lot of suffering and a lot of things that are wrong. And
Mm.
it has become the knee jerk reaction of Americans to say, let's get the police to fix it. So
Right.
we have continued to expand their purview of things that they're expected to fix. And yet they have a one tool and it only works well in a very narrow field of use, and yet we have asked them
Okay.
to use it for all sorts of different things. So I think yes, absolutely, there are powerful forces that
Mhm.
are lobbying to continue us
Persuading
down
policy, and
this
yeah.
this same
Yeah.
path. Now, where I would differ is to say, do they are they knowingly doing that, knowing that it's hurting people? And I'm willing to give people mostly the benefit of the doubt to say, humans are most of us believe whatever we're doing is the right thing to do. Certainly, there are some people who act against their
Yeah.
consciences knowingly for profit, but I think for most people, that's been my experience with the vast majority of law enforcement.
Sure.
We've had a lot
Sure.
of them who have come to our events across Mississippi, and the vast majority of them want to help people. they're trying to figure out how to help people in their communities. They're frustrated that they keep arresting
Mhm.
the same people over and over again for drug possession, and it isn't bringing about the
It's
positive
not
change that they
helping. Yeah.
want it to see
Mhm.
in their life. And so I guess yes to your question, and yet I'm willing to be much more gracious in terms of people's intent with that. I think most people believe they're doing good things, and they just, like me, have never stopped to think. They've never spent time learning to figure out, oh, is this actually helping people, or is this potentially creating a lot of harm? And when you've got money wrapped
Mhm.
up in that, it becomes even harder to see.
Yeah.
So you've got kind of your own internal investment of how you've spent your
Sure.
career and all of that. But then when money's wrapped up in that, yes, I think it becomes even harder for us to
Yeah.
see.
Yeah, and I wanna agree with you that I 100% agree that the vast majority of police officers, are folks that are serving on that level are just amazing, amazing people, and I'm so grateful for them. I just think when we start getting up top of the food chain and we start, talking about billions of dollars being
Mhm.
invested, you know what I mean? Like, it's the kind of
Yeah.
thing where greed really messes with all this stuff. I mean, greed is the reason. I mean, that's the thing that's behind the drug industry, right? Like, I mean, it's money, it's
Yeah, it's
profits
money.
driving
Yeah.
all of it. And when you get people that are willing to exploit people that are not in the best situation for your own profits, then it gets really, it gets really, really messy. And when you have people that are, as you said, where there's lobbying efforts and that sort of thing, and now you have people that are like throwing a lot of money that have influence in the areas of policy changes, whether they take place or not or don't take place. It's for sure an uphill battle, and I think that your voice and others that are speaking into this, that whether we were talking about this issue or any one of a number of issues that are so important in our world today, to really see the changes and the transformations, to see the reformation of these areas. I mean, it's just so essential. And I think that the more that people like you keep pushing those changes over time, tend to have a snowball effect, and hopefully affect greater things down the road. Would you quickly touch on, I mentioned Portugal, and they've been at this for, I think, what, a couple of decades now, since they began they had a massive just policy shift in the way that they deal with criminalization for drug possession and that sort of thing. And it seems like they've had some incredible results because of that over a period of many, many years now that they've been into this. Would you discuss that a little bit? Because I know you know a lot more about that than I
Yeah.
do. It's a good
Yeah.
case study, I think, for what could happen.
Yeah, so Portugal in 2001 had a huge heroin overdose crisis, and they took the biggest shift that any country had taken up to that point to roll back these policies of criminalization, and they just addressed this consumer piece. So they don't have legal drugs there. They still have contamination problems, although they don't have
Mm,
fentanyl in their market. So that's an important note. That is, will eventually expand worldwide, but it is largely a United States problem, the fentanyl problem
mm,
currently. So they just chose to address this consumer harm category. And they said, instead of criminalizing people and arresting them, what if we try to help them build lives that they want to be fully present for? Really try to address
mhm,
this drug use problem as a public health issue. And so they shifted a lot of funding around. They made it incredibly easy for people to get treatment and accessible, not just financially, but
mm.
accessible where people are working, that there's treatment options close to that. It's not 20 miles out of town where they
Yeah.
need to go every day to get, the help that they need. And so they did things like making treatment more available. They offered tax breaks to businesses who would be hiring people coming out of recovery and incarceration, that sort of thing. They basically said, how could we shift this approach from trying to traumatize people out of drug use into trying to help them build a life where they don't want to use drugs anymore?
Mhm.
And what they found is injection drug use rate dropped in half,
Mm.
drug addiction rates dropped by a third, drug related crime rates dropped. Because as fewer people are addicted, you also have fewer people committing theft or prostitution in order to get enough money to be able to
Mm.
support a drug
Wow.
addiction. And so they had just really phenomenal results from that, and credit that to investing in this other side. So they spend,
Yes.
90% of their drug intervention money on prevention and treatment and only 10% of it on enforcement. Whereas the US does exactly the opposite, spending 90% on enforcement and 10%
Enforcement.
on
Yeah.
prevention and treatment.
Wow.
So it's a really amazing case study to see what's possible. Now, their healthcare system's very different from ours. It's certainly not translatable one for one to the United States, but the overarching ideas behind it of treating drug use as a health issue and figuring out how to leverage that perspective in their healthcare system and addiction system and criminal justice system had really tremendous results. And we would love to see that
Mm.
shift happen here, not because we can guarantee a particular outcome, but because we know that addiction is a health issue and it absolutely should be addressed as one. And that's how we're going to get better outcomes, is to begin trying
Right.
different approaches of how do we help people through this healthcare lens rather than through this criminal justice system lens. We're going to continue getting negative outcomes as long as we're using the wrong tool.
Mm.
If you're using the wrong tool, it just cannot produce the kind of results that
Yeah.
you want. Using the right tool is still going to take some trial and error to figure out really what
Absolutely.
works to help the most people, but it's a pathway towards hope. And that is what people have said about the book. There's a pastor who has spent he's in the later years of his ministry, and he read my book Curious, and he said, this is really a book of great hope. And that's what I want people to get from it. It's not a book that's going to beat them over the head with a certain way of thinking. It's a book that says, come join me on my own learning journey and see where you land. And I think it could change the way our churches deal with people who are struggling with addiction. I think it could change how our families approach loved ones who are
Mhm.
struggling. And I think whether or not we want to see any policy change happen, there are lots of ways that our own hearts, minds, and culture can change that make it a much more healing and life giving experience and opportunity for people.
Yes.
Because no matter how deeply we might have been hurt by someone in our family who is struggling with an addiction, the best path out of that hurt is not to perpetuate an approach that is continuing to
Mhm.
push them deeper into that. It is to try to help them make that shift. And that's a lot of what our work is helping people understand why that shame and blame route does not produce the outcomes that we want it to, and helping
Yeah.
people catch a vision for a different approach. It's not an approach that says what you're doing is okay. It's just an approach that says, can we look it full in the face for what it really
Yes.
is and come at it
Yes.
with solutions and tools that actually have a chance at working.
Yeah, that's the thing, is like to honestly evaluate and to take that honest position to say it's clear that this has not worked. Like like the war on drugs has been the most unsuccessful war that we've ever fought. And we've had some pretty unsuccessful wars, so that's saying a lot. But it's it's the approach to it is not working because, as you said, it's, I think, so devoid many times. Again, not talking about an individual basis with, not putting any disparagement on, individual law enforcement people or anything like that. So not on an individual basis, but by and large, it's a system that doesn't really operate according to compassion. It doesn't operate according to a pro-life view of this. But I think what you just said there was just very, very well said, that there are going to be pain points, right? Like if we were to switch this, if we were to do, like if we were to take the stance that Portugal took, which I don't see us doing that. Like I don't see us making that kind of a drastic shift. I think it would have to be the way that it would happen in this country would be little by little. It'd be the low hanging fruit. It'd be kind of going after, certain aspects of this at a time. But I would hope that over time it would again snowball into something that really has positive effects. But if we were to do that, there would definitely be those pain points at the beginning. There would be that trial and error. There would be, oh, like, oh, we switched this around. This got better, but this actually got worse. And so we've got to actually maybe pour a little bit more into this area. We've got to find a solution for that. And we've got to go through it. I think that what inevitably happens when you make a shift and then you see that you don't get the best outcome right away is then it becomes something that you can look at from a distance very cynically and say, see, it doesn't work and we got to go back to the way things were done. Correct me if I'm wrong. Didn't like in Oregon, in Portland in particular, they instituted as like Proposition 110 or something like that, where they essentially tried to take a similar approach to what they're doing in Portugal. And again, correct me if I'm wrong, it hasn't worked. It hasn't had, in a shorter period of time, of course, but it hasn't really had good results. But I don't think that they've actually gone to the extent of what you're talking about there, where the funds are actually reallocated to helping with more the health side of things, the therapeutic side of things, the modality, putting the modalities in place to actually help people deal with the drug addiction. And they haven't actually taken all of those steps that are necessary. Am I understanding that
Mm.
correctly?
Yeah, so I think there's a few things with Oregon that are helpful to keep in mind. So they decriminalize possession, so people aren't arrested
Hmm.
for possession of drugs anymore. And they expanded access to care, in part using cannabis tax dollars
Mm,
to increase their access to treatment. And so they haven't had as many people take them up on the treatment side as some people were hoping would happen, and it hasn't had a big impact on overdose. Now, I would look at that and say it couldn't have a big impact on overdose.
right.
Overdose isn't a The contaminated drug market isn't a function of arresting consumers. It's the problem of contaminated markets, and that,
True. Yeah. Yeah.
110 didn't do anything to change the contamination of
Like,
the
mhm.
drugs people are using. But also there's a long history of people who have struggled with addiction who have been treated terribly in the healthcare system. I've even had
Mm,
people. I went to church with a guy who said, he is a college professor, a PhD, and he had a medical event in his house and ended up falling and knocking out his front teeth. And his wife took him to
mm,
the emergency room, and he got in there, and he was in a huge amount of pain because he had serious back problems, and they wouldn't give him pain medicine because they said, no, he's just here, he's just an addict, he's here just trying to get pain medicine. We don't believe him.
he knocked his
And
teeth out to get
yes.
pain medicine. That's
Yeah,
what.
well, or I
That's
think the thought was, he's not just knocked his teeth out, but that he has had, his drug use over time has caused his teeth to, be in
right.
the condition that they're in. And
Okay.
so they would not believe that he was in extreme, excruciating pain and from his back, and it would not give him the medicine until somebody walked in who worked in the hospital that knew him. And they said, "Oh my goodness, Doctor so and so, what are you doing here?" And immediately everything changed. He immediately
Wow.
got help. He immediately got the medicine he needed. He said it just totally shifted his perspective of realizing when they had thought that he was just an addict, he had been
Right.
treated terribly. When they realized that
Yeah.
he was a college professor, suddenly it
Hmm.
it
Yeah.
changed.
He was more valuable. Hmm.
Yeah, and there was this immediate belief that, oh, he is really
Hmm.
struggling with pain rather than he's just trying to come in here
Yeah.
and get drugs. And so, in terms of how many people are immediately calling a helpline and asking for help, that's going to take a lot of time to build back the trust that we have lost from people who
Yeah.
have been treated terribly. And some people aren't ready to get help yet. But this is probably a good place to bring up this point. When we talk about not arresting people for possession, it's important to differentiate that from not arresting them for anything. And I think that's a
Mhm.
fear people have.
Mhm.
Oh, wait a second. Does this mean people who are using drugs can go do whatever they want to? They can go, live in the city park. They can go use drugs in front of, my kid's school. They can go, just do whatever they want to. And nobody's going to be able to do anything about it.
Yeah.
And we would say, no, it's important for the community that we make clear distinctions between not arresting people for drug possession and not arresting people for breaking any number of other laws, whether that's public intoxication, whether that is, anything. There are lots of different ordinances and laws that
Right.
cities have,
Right.
and you do need to abide by those. This is not a free pass to go live whatever life you want to on anybody's property. This is saying no possession. That's not helping people to arrest them for
Yeah.
that. And yet, absolutely, cities need to have the ability to enforce the laws that keep the rest of the community safe and keep public land safe, that protect other people's rights of their
Mhm.
own private property and their own um, so I think that's where there can be some confusion of this kind of pendulum swing all the way in the other direction to we're not going to do anything to anybody who's using drugs. And we would say the middle ground is
Mm.
where we want to fall there, where we allow adults to make their a personal choice, but when that bleeds into choices that impact the community and that are breaking other laws,
Right.
yes, it's
Right.
appropriate for communities to be able to enforce those laws to keep
Right.
public order.
Yeah, that's an important distinction for sure. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah,
Mhm.
because yeah, we're talking about like non-violent, offenses, not and that sort of thing. And it just reminded me there's in Mexico, I think in Germany, and there's a handful of well, more than a handful. There's a number of countries around the world where if you are incarcerated, it's actually like in Mexico, if you're incarcerated, it's not illegal to escape. So so, like,
Hmm.
because they look at it like freedom is it's a basic human need or desire or
Mm.
something for that everybody is going to pursue, and so they say that it's not illegal for you to escape as long as you don't commit any crimes while you're escaping. So if you're destroying property, if you're hurting somebody, if you're,
Mm.
that sort of like if you're bribing somebody, like if you're doing any of those things. So it kind of eliminates what you can do to
Right.
find your way out. But it's like if you won't get in trouble, you won't get a longer sentence or whatever just because you're making an attempt to try to escape prison if you get caught or
That's
whatever
interesting.
the case may be. So anyway, as you were talking about it,
Huh.
it's like, yeah, so it's not just it's not saying like everything goes like because this is
Mhm.
legal, then all of a sudden like it makes the things that people do when they're doing this thing that's currently illegal, like because there are a lot of uh secondary offenses that happen when somebody is consuming illegal drugs.
Yeah.
There are all kinds of things that happen,
Yep.
like drinking and driving, or
Yep.
driving while intoxicated
Yep.
on any kind of substance or whatever is clearly that's never been okay. Well, it used to
Right.
be okay, I guess, but it hasn't been okay for many
Yeah.
many years, and that's
Yep.
not something we're not talking about just a free for all where anything goes. We're just talking about, I think, essentially, boiling it down to approaching people with dignity, with a pro life, mindset of, valuing the humanity of the person and recognizing that probably if they're consuming these illegal substances, it's because they have an addiction, and so we shouldn't treat that like a criminal offense.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Good stuff.
Well, would you just tell us real quickly about End It for Good? So you founded it in 2019. It's a nonprofit taking a pro-life and value-centered approach to drugs, prioritizing life and giving people opportunity to just thrive.
Mhm.
Since you started this, well, what's the focus of it, and what has the progress been like? Like, what have you seen so far?
Yeah, so the vast majority of what we do is educational. So it is out in communities, either hosting events or doing podcasts or giving presentations, um, that it's helping the general public rethink what we've been doing. A big part of
Mhm.
that is helping people understand why it hasn't worked. Most people know we use the criminal justice system. Most people are frustrated that it hasn't worked well. There's
Yeah.
very few people who say what we're doing is working great. Where the difference comes in is which solutions are we open to. So a big part
Mhm.
of what we do is try to help people understand why that solution has not worked well, why it has not been a solution, but has actually created a lot of additional problems. But then also to present those solutions and get the community thinking about that. So it
Mm.
started we started just doing events, and that has turned into other things, writing articles and doing interviews and presentations. Our newest thing is my book Curious that just came out. But we believe that change happens by people being educated on what's happening and what the other potential solutions are, and offered an opportunity to learn and take action. So
Mm.
people don't know what they don't know. And I didn't know most of this information. And even though I'm a college educated person who loves to read, loves to learn, it just had not crossed my radar. And so that has
Yeah.
been our experience for most people. Most people are operating out of the same kind of cultural, what we've been told culturally for the
Mhm.
last many decades. And so we do a lot of educational work on that front, whether it's through events or writing or whatever it is. And then that has opened doors for us to talk to policymakers about it, to educate them on why these solutions that we believe could work. And it has really been a wonderful journey of, even for people who don't agree with us on the solutions, they
Mhm.
appreciate the approach that we take, which is non confrontational, it's very invitational. We can be friends even if we disagree on the best path forward. We can agree
Yes.
on some things and not all things. There's lots of opportunity here. Nobody needs to stick a flag in the ground and say you either are with me on this or we're enemies. I just
Mhm.
don't think that is, I don't think it's healthy in culture. I don't think it's healthy in faith. No matter how deeply I believe something, the best opportunity that I'm going to have to help someone understand why I believe it is to keep those lines of communication open, to keep
Mhm.
a good dialogue happening, to try to understand why do they think the way they do? If I want them to take the time to understand how I think, I need to invest the time to understand how they think. And so that has been a wonderful part of this, is being able to spend time with a growing group of policymakers who are interested in learning and then in seeing what their constituents might be open to. That's
Mm.
included law enforcement who are interested in learning what could help them be more effective at their jobs and to build better relationships in the community. And so that is the majority of End It for Good's work. It is out there trying to first build the community support and then influence the people who can actually change the policies. Because changed policies only happen when enough people change their minds. Policymakers
Mm.
will not change anything if their voters do not support that. So we
Wow.
spend the vast majority of our time out in the community educating people who influence their leaders, and then some of that time influencing and educating leaders so that as public opinion shifts, they're also educated themselves and can know which approaches can move us forward. So just here in Mississippi this year, we passed fentanyl testing strips are now legal. So people can get these little strips that they can use to test the drugs they're about to take. And they will let them, it pops up whether or not it contains fentanyl, which just allows them to know ahead of time, hey, maybe I should use
Mhm.
less. Maybe I should make sure I'm with somebody when I'm using. It doesn't
Mm.
it doesn't encourage them to use, it just tries to keep them alive if they're going to use
Yeah.
anyway,
Yeah.
that they don't die while they're doing it.
Yeah.
And so that's a big shift for us here, to not go down more, let's just crack down harder, let's increase penalties, but instead,
Mm.
let's provide access to something that could help people stay alive. So shifts like
Wow.
that are happening, and it's really encouraging to see, and really great to be able to talk about with you and
Yeah.
your audience also.
Man, I appreciate it so much. Just out of curiosity, how hard was it to for that to pass? Was that a simple thing, or did that take a while for the fentanyl test strips? Was that
So it was
something
introduced
that
2 years
was
ago and it failed.
okay?
Came back this year, was passed unanimously. So,
Okay.
it just goes to show what can happen.
Yeah.
People do change their
Yeah.
minds. Policymakers change their minds. They're trying to learn about a whole host of issues. This is just one of the things they
Yeah.
actually, vote on. And so it does take time for people to be educated, for them to think about um, a new idea and then to potentially support that new idea. And so I would encourage anyone, wherever you are, whether you're trying to work with your pastor to get something started at your church to help people, or whether you're working with your mayor or whoever, to just give people the time and give them an opportunity to keep learning. A lot of times that's just the pathway to change, is helping people have a space to ask questions and the time that they need to really think through ideas and move to a place where they feel like, yeah, that does make sense, and I think we can get on board with that. And so um, I think it's always been important to me to make a pretty clear distinction in terms of what I'm hoping to see from pastors. I would love for
Mhm.
pastors. I think it can get really muddy really quickly when pastors are, telling their people what they should vote on. I don't think that's really helpful, but pastors do influence a lot how their church members approach struggling people and how they approach
Yeah.
family members of struggling people. And our churches absolutely can grow in our ability to offer belonging and support and understanding and compassionate
Mm.
care for people who are touched in all different ways related to addiction. And I think that would
Mm.
be the hope I have, and the what I hope to see happen in churches is not that they suddenly become, uh, political lobbying arms, but that they look inside and say, how can we provide that for people in our community? Because deep community and relationships and
Yeah.
supportive um, communities are the best addiction prevention tool that we have,
Come on.
allowing people to find the relationships they long for and to find the healing for the hurts in their lives. Churches can provide that. And that's the
Mhm.
best thing we can do all along that spectrum, whether it's for people to help them never go down that path, or to recover from that path, or to walk with their loved one through that path. We can do that no matter if any policy ever changes.
So good. Christina, where can people go to find your book, to find End It for Good, or to connect with you further?
Yeah, they can go to enditforgood.com. There's lots of resources there. You can buy the book on Amazon. You can also get it through the enditforgood.com website. It'll take you over to Amazon. But it's called Curious, a foster mom's discovery of an unexpected solution to drugs and addiction. It's not a policy book. It is my life story. It's just my
Yeah.
life story on this particular issue. So it's a quick read. It's a engaging read, and I think will leave you thoughtful and hopefully a little
Mhm.
inspired. So yeah, come join us over enditforgood.com. That'll connect you to all sorts of resources, our newsletter, social media, and all of that. We'd love to have you join this journey with us.
Guys, get the book. Pick up the book, Curious, and even just for um, the stories that you share, Christina, in the book are just they're so impactful. And one of the things here is that you talked about from the very beginning of your journey here with uh, is it Joanna?
Joanne. Oh yeah, the
Joanne.
end of her story is also in the book. So
Yeah.
more there too.
Yeah, yeah, because I don't think we got all the way to the end.
Yeah.
I think I kept interrupting you. But the thing about it is, coming in with those preconceived notions, those preconceived ideas, and it's interesting how quickly our preconceived ideas can begin, maybe not 100% like right away, crash all the way to the bottom, but how our preconceived thoughts and opinions that are wrong, how they can begin to disintegrate when we make a real meaningful human connection with
Mm,
somebody who
yes.
goes against the grain of what we've been taught. And
Yeah.
we've seen that happen with people when it comes to like, racist ideology. and they meet somebody who is a member of that particular group of people that they had hatred for, that they were indoctrinated against. Then they meet that person, and it's like that worldview falls apart because they're like, you're not anything like what they told me that you were like. And it's
Yeah.
like that situation where it's like, hold on, like this mother is not anything like what I expected that she would be like based on my preconceived thought of who she is or who she was as a
Mhm.
person. She has real love in her heart for this child of hers. And so maybe I need to rethink.
Mm.
Maybe I need to, we're not trying to tell anybody how they should think or how they should feel about this or whatever. But I love the invitation of the book. I love the invitation of your conversation today and really all the work that you do of inviting people to see a different perspective and to reevaluate. And we all
Mm.
have to do that at different times in our lives, constantly, really just reevaluating things, like reevaluating why we think the way that we think about this. Is there a better way? Is there a more pro-life approach to this? Is there a more compassionate approach to this? Is there a more loving approach to this? Whatever. And I think that that's something that you really do in your book and in all the work that you do. So thank you for writing it. Thank you for the work that you do. And once again, just thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate
Thanks,
it.
Duke. It was really great to be with you. I love being able to hit so many diverse angles of this topic. I think people will see this is really complex. This is not an easy thing to dive into, not an easy thing to solve, and yet incredibly important. I think it's just one of the pressing issues of our day because it is affecting almost every family in America.
Mm, yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, thanks again, everybody, for joining us. Appreciate you guys so much. Check out the book Curious on Amazon. Check out enditforgood.com and those other resources that Christina mentioned. Appreciate you guys, and we'll see you next time.